Il Presidente. La seduta è aperta.
The sitting is open.
L'ordine del giorno.
On our agenda, we will have the statement by the President of the Commission on the State of the Union. And without any further ado, I shall give the floor to the President of the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker.
Monsieur le Président,
President, President in Office of the Council, honourable members, good morning. Sometimes history moves discreetly with careful steps. When we're talking about the work of a commission, which only has a 5-year period to make some substantial change, over such a short period of time, you can't bring about a sea change in the state of affairs. The current Commission, like its predecessors, is an episode, a brief moment in time in the long history of the European Union. Our time has not yet come in our Commission, so I'm not yet going to take stock before you of everything we've done over the last 4 years. On the contrary, I will tell you that work will continue over the coming months to ensure that our imperfect European Union becomes a little more perfect every day. We still have things to do, which is what I wish to discuss with you this morning. No satisfaction, modesty, turning to our results. That's the approach of our Commission as we look at our agenda over the coming months. Sometimes history, in the true sense of the word, thrusts itself into the life of nations without any prior warning. That's what happened at the time of World War I. In 1914, it caught the continent off guard. It was a sunny, calm, optimistic year in 1913. In 1913, Europeans were expecting to live through a lasting peace. And yet, a fratricidal war descended on Europe the next year. I'm referring to that period not just because, or rather not because I'm suggesting that we're on the verge of a similar catastrophe in Europe. The European Union is a guarantee of peace. Let's be happy that we live on a continent of peace. A continent which enjoys peace thanks to the European Union.
respectons donc.
So let us show more respect to the European Union. Let us not sully its image. Let us defend our way of life, our way of being. let's embrace a type of patriotism that's not directed against others. And let us decry knee-jerk nationalism which attacks others and seeks scapegoats rather than looking for solutions which will allow us to coexist better.
Le pacte fondateur de l'Union européenne.
The founding principle of the Union, no more war, never again. This informs our lives and those of everyone around us. What is the state of the Union today, in 2018? Europe has very much got past the economic and financial crisis, which hit us coming from elsewhere and had a very brutal impact on us. Europe, as said by the Lehman Brothers, we've had nearly 12 million jobs created since 2014. The economy is growing. That's more than the number of people living in Belgium. Never have we had so many people, 239 million men and women, at work in Europe. Youth unemployment stands at 14.8%. That figure is still too high, but it's the lowest level since 2000. Investment has come back to Europe, thanks in particular to the European Fund for Strategic Investment, which some, fewer and fewer, are calling the Juncker plan. That has generated 235 billion worth of public and private investment, and we're on target for 400 billions worth. And then in Greece, after years which, it must be said, were painful years, following unprecedented social problems, Greece has made a success of its programme and is back on its feet. I pay homage once again to the Herculean efforts of the Greek people, an effort that others in Europe have still not acknowledged sufficiently.
J'ai toujours défendu.
I have always, as you know, defended Greece, its dignity, its role in Europe, and in particular its continued membership of the Eurozone, and I'm still proud of that. Europe has also reasserted its trade position. It's a global trade power. This is proof, if ever there was, of the need to pool sovereignty. The European Union today has trade agreements with 70 countries. Taken together, we account for 40% of world GDP. The trade agreements I'm talking about have very often been called into question, wrongly. They enable us to export high European food safety standards around the world, as well as workers' rights, environmental standards, and consumer law standards. When last July, during a dangerous period of international tension, I visited both Beijing and Tokyo as well as Washington in 1 week, I was able to speak in my capacity as President of the Commission on behalf of the largest single market in the world, on behalf of a union which accounts for 1/5 of the total world economy, a union which is prepared to defend its values and its interests. I represented Europe as an open continent, but not one that we will hand over. I was able to set out our position in detail and in principle, and I was able to achieve palpable results for our citizens and our firms. When we are united, we Europeans, as a union, have become a force to be reckoned with that you cannot do without. Some in Europe were unhappy with the agreement I reached with President Trump. Some were surprised by it, but there shouldn't have been a surprise. Whenever Europe speaks as one, we can impose our position on others. Where necessary, Europe must act as one. We demonstrated this with our ceaseless efforts to defend the Paris Climate Agreement. We, as Europeans, want to leave a cleaner planet to coming generations. I agree with our Energy Commissioner's analysis of the CO2 emission cuts for 2030. They're scientifically right and politically necessary. The terrible events of this summer have brought home, not just to farmers, the importance of our efforts to safeguard the future for coming generations. Now, of course, you may choose to ignore the climate challenge and look the other way. We in the Commission and you in Parliament must look towards the future. Ladies and gentlemen, the clock is still ticking. The world is ever more volatile. The challenges before our continent are growing day after day, and so we cannot ease up in our efforts, even for 1 second, as we seek to build a more united and stronger Europe. Europe can export its stability, as we did with our successive enlargements. As far as I'm concerned, those enlargements have been and remain success stories because we've managed to bring together European geography and history. But efforts still remain to be made. We need a forthright definition of our attitude towards the accession of Western Balkan countries. Otherwise, others will take it upon themselves to shape our immediate neighbourhood. Let us look around us and see what's happening at this time in Syria, in Idlib. The course of events should be a source of great immediate concern to us all. We cannot remain silent in the face of an impending humanitarian disaster, which is a disaster foretold. The Syrian conflict shows us how the international order, which Europeans have taken advantage of since World War II, has increasingly been called into question. Furthermore, in today's world, Europe can no longer rest assured that the commitments entered into in the past will still be respected in the future. Yesterday's alliances may no longer be tomorrow's alliances. As I was saying, today's world needs a strong, united Europe. A Europe working for peace, trade agreements, stable monetary arrangements, even if others elsewhere are all too inclined to resort to commercial or monetary warfare. I don't like that mercantilism which acts with no regard for others' interests. I remain a convinced multilateralist. If Europe better realises its political power, its economic power, and sometimes it's the military power of its competitor nations, we will no longer have to be the global repay a loan, although we are still willing to pay.
But we have to be global players too. C'est la raison pour laquelle, en dépit d'une forte résistance.
That's why, despite strong resistance at the time, as of 2014, I relaunched the European Defence Union. That's why, in the coming months, the Commission will continue its work on the European Defence Fund and permanent structured cooperation in defence to make them fully operational. I should add a point of detail which I think is rather important in this context. We will not be militarising the European Union. What we're seeking is greater responsibility and independence, because only a strong, united Europe will be in a position to defend our citizens from internal and external threats, be it terrorism or climate change. Only a strong, united Europe can save jobs in an open, interconnected world. Only a strong, united Europe will make it possible for us to rise to the challenge of global digitalisation. We Europeans, because we are the largest market in the world, will be able to set standards, data, climate standards, while upholding our citizens' conditions of life, provided we are united. A strong, united Europe will allow its member states to reach for the stars. Thanks to our Galileo programme, Europe is still in the space race. No single member state would have been able to launch the satellites that 400 million users around the world are already benefiting from. No member state could have done it on its own. Galileo is a success story. Primarily a European success story. Without Europe, there would be no Galileo. Let's be proud of that. President, geopolitics tells us that the bell is sounding for Europe's sovereignty. Europe has to embrace its destiny. Europe has a capacity to influence world affairs. Europe must increasingly be a sovereign player in international relations.
La souveraineté européenne.
European sovereignty derives from the national sovereignty of our member states. It does not replace what properly lies within the national purview. By pooling sovereignty where necessary, we strengthen all our component nations and regions. That's part and parcel of belonging to the European Union. European sovereignty will never be directed against others. Europe must remain a tolerant, open continent and will remain so. Europe will never become a fortress turning its back on the world, in particular the suffering part of the world. Europe must and will remain a multilateral continent because the world belongs to everyone, not just the few.
Tel est aussi l'enjeu des élections au Parlement européen.
And that's what's at stake in the European elections in May 2019. In the 250 days between now and then, we must get across to our citizens the evidence that when we act together, the European Union can achieve results, and it respects the commitments we entered into at the beginning of our period of office. Between now and the European elections, we must show that Europe is able to overcome differences between the North and the South, the East and the West. The European Union, Europe is too small to split itself into two today and four tomorrow. We have to show clearly that together, East, West, South and North, we're able to plant the seeds of a more sovereign Europe. President, distinguished members, in May 2019, there will be elections. The citizens of Europe won't be interested in what the Commission is proposing, but it will interest them that companies pay their taxes where they make their profits. Voters want a lot from you, not all of you. I know the voters want to know that the Commission proposal will rapidly become a reality. Those who want that are right. If Europeans in 2019, if they want, they won't be they'll be interested in what the Commission does on plastics. If the Europeans, if we want to convince them, we need a European law which cements the ban on plastics. We all declare in fine speeches that we want to be more ambitious in big issues and less ambitious in smaller things. In May 2019, the Europeans won't applaud if twice a year we have to continue to change the clocks twice a year. We need to change this business of changing the clocks. The member states, based on subsidiarity, should decide whether their citizens should live in summer or winter time. We expect that Council and Parliament say this in the same way, and will make sure that regional single market conform solutions will be found. Time is pressing. In the months ahead, we should work closer together so what we promised in 2014 can be delivered in good time before the European elections. When we started, we all promised to deliver in a digital single market, a better monetary union, a banking union, a fair single market, an energy policy, a comprehensive migration policy, a union of safety and security. At least most of us undertook that the social dimension of Europe shouldn't be in second place. It should be treated more seriously. The Commission, all the initiatives that we announced in the Commission in 2014 were put on the table. Half of them were already adopted by Council and Parliament. 20% are well advanced, and 30% are stuck in some difficult negotiations. I don't accept that the Commission is responsible for all the faults itself. Of course, there have been shortcomings. Our proposals are well known. In particular, when it comes to refugees and migration, they should be adopted and implemented. I won't allow in future, I know this will happen, that the Commission is made the sole scapegoat. Scapegoats exist in all institutions, at least of them in the Commission and the Parliament. Leadership broad front is needed. goes to being a security union. The Europeans expect, quite rightly, the European Union protects them. So the Commission is proposing new rules today to counter terrorist propaganda and to take it down. External borders must be protected more effectively. So we're proposing that the number of border agencies from the finance from the European budget by 2020 will be 10,000. We're making a proposal to extend the European Refugee Agency. They need support when it comes to processing asylum applications in line with the Geneva Convention. We're making a proposal for the return of illegal migrants. I repeat my wish in Parliament, which is a call to open legal routes for migration into Europe. We need qualified migrants. The Commission proposals on this have been on the table for some time, so please implement them.
President, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to talk about the future as well. And we therefore must speak of Africa, Europe's twin continent. By 2050, Africa's population will number 2.5 billion. 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. We need to invest more in our relationship with the nations of this great and noble continent. And we have to stop seeing the Africa-EU relationship through the sole prism of development aid. Such an approach is inadequate and is humiliating for Africa. Africa does not need charity. It needs a true and balanced partnership. And Europe needs this partnership just as much. In preparing my speech today, I spoke with my African friends, notably Paul Kagame, the chairperson of the African Union, and we agreed that donor-recipient relations are a thing of the past, and we agreed that reciprocal commitments are the way forward. We want to build a new partnership with Africa.
La Commission propose aujourd'hui.
Today, we are proposing a new alliance between Europe and Africa, an alliance for investment and sustainable jobs. This alliance, as we see it, would help create up to 10 million jobs in Africa over the next 5 years. And we want to create a framework that brings more investment to Africa. And we are not starting from scratch. Our external investment plan, which was launched 2 years ago, will mobilise over 44 billion euro in both the public and private sectors. The projects which are in the pipeline will be to the tune of 24 billion euro. We want to focus our investment where our actions make a real difference. By 2020, the EU will have supported 35,000 African students and researchers through the Erasmus programme. By 2027, this figure should reach 105,000. Trade between Africa and Europe is important, is significant. 36% of Africa's trade is with the European Union. But trade between us is not enough. I'm convinced that we also have to make progress on other agreements and have a continent-to-continent economic partnership between equal partners and move towards a free trade agreement.
Another issue where I see a strong need for the Union for leadership is Brexit. I will not enter into the details of the negotiations, which are being masterfully handled by my friend Michel Barnier. He works on the basis of a unanimous position confirmed time and again by the 27 member states. However, allow me to recall 3 principles which should guide our work on Brexit in the months to come. First of all, we respect, of course, the British decision to leave our union. Yeah. But we regret it deeply, as you are. But we also ask the British government to understand that someone who leaves the union cannot be in the same privileged position as a member state. If you leave the union, you are, of course, no longer part of our single market, and certainly not only in parts of it. Secondly, the European Commission, this Parliament and all other member states will always show loyalty and solidarity with Ireland when it comes to the Irish border. This is why we want to find a creative solution that prevents a hard border in Northern Ireland. And we will defend all the elements of the Good Friday Agreement. It is Brexit that is making the border more visible in Northern Ireland. It's not the European Union. Thirdly, after the 29th of March 2019, the United Kingdom will never be an ordinary third country for us. The United Kingdom will always be a very close neighbour and partner in political, economic and security terms. In the past months, when we needed unity in the Union, Britain was at our side, driven by the same values and principles of all other Europeans. This is why I welcome Prime Minister May's proposal to develop an ambitious new partnership for the future after Brexit. We agree with the statement made in Chequers that the starting point for such a partnership should be a free trade area between the United Kingdom and the European Union. On the basis of these principles, the Commission's negotiators, mainly my good friend Michel Barnier, stand ready to work day and night to reach a deal. We owe it to our citizens and our businesses to ensure the United Kingdom's withdrawal is orderly and that there is stability afterwards. It will not be the Commission that will stand in the way of this. Mesdames et Messieurs les députés,
Ladies and gentlemen, members, between now and the European elections and between now and the summit that will take place on the 9th of May of next year in Romania, a lot of work remains to be done. And we'll have to convince our citizens that we share the same purpose of our European Union. In Sibiu, we need to make sure that we get things right. People want certainty. They expect a clear message and don't want half measures to be taken. So let's not give them those then. And this is all part of the European agenda en route to Sibiu. In Sibiu, we'll have to ratify the partnership agreement between the EU and Japan. And we'll have to enter into that agreement for economic reasons, but also for geopolitical meetings. Between now and Sibiu, will have to organise an agreement on principle for the post-2020 EU budget. And we need to give young Europeans an opportunity to make the most of what the Erasmus programme has to offer, and we need to make sure that enough money is available for it, and we'll have to decide on that matter as we will have to decide on other matters. And if we want to give our researchers and startups more opportunities and prevent funding gaps costing jobs, we will have to decide on the budget before the elections. Now, without militarising the European Union, if we want to increase defence spending by a factor of 20, again, we will have to decide on this before the elections. If we want to increase our investment in Africa by 23%, again, we must decide quickly. Heads of state, ministers, MEPs, national members of parliament, we always hear that we can't decide on these matters before the elections because that would lead to a democratic crisis. I say no. It's normal in a democracy to have elections, and it's also normal to take certain decisions before those elections. By next year, we will also have to develop the international role of the euro, which has now existed for 20 years. And this, in spite of the criticism that has been levelled at it, the euro has been successful. It's the second global currency after the dollar. 60 countries, in one way or another, have pegged their currency to the euro. But we need to do more to make sure that our single currency can play its full role on the international scene. And recent developments have highlighted the need to deepen our monetary union, and the Commission has a lot of proposals that it wants to adopt. We must and will go further. It's an aberration to have $3 billion worth of energy imports a year. That's 80%. When only a small part of that comes from the United States, and it's an aberration to see that European companies are buying European planes in dollars and not in euro, and that's something we will have to change as well.
C'est la raison pour laquelle
this is why the Commission, before the end of the year, will present initiatives to strengthen the international role of the euro. The euro must become the active instrument of a new and more sovereign Europe. We must, of course, first put our own house in order by strengthening our economic and monetary union, which is what we have already started to do. Without a strengthened economic and monetary union, we won't be able to achieve this. We have to complete our economic and monetary union so that the euro can become stronger. And still on the road to Sibiu, I would like to make tangible progress when it comes to strengthening our foreign policy. We need to improve our ability to speak with one voice when it comes to foreign policy. It is not right that our union silenced itself at the United Nations Human Rights Council when it came to condemning human rights abuses by China and this because one member state opposed it. That is just one amongst many examples I could give you.
C'est la raison pour laquelle aujourd'hui
And that's the reason why the Commission, again, would propose to you that qualified majority voting is used on matters of foreign policy.
je répète un message
I would repeat the message that I set out in detail last year, and we will be putting forward a number of proposals so that in certain areas, not all areas of foreign policy, we can move towards qualified majority voting. The treaty as it stands allows the EU to take a decision on this basis, and I think the time has now come to use this lost treasure of the Lisbon Treaty, and I think we should be able to decide on certain matters by qualified majority. And I also think that in relation to certain tax matters, we should be able to decide by qualified majority.
un mot, Monsieur le Président, pour dire que d'autres façons
Mr. President, we have disagreements between governments and between institutions. Increasingly, there are disagreements. Heated exchanges amongst governments and institutions are becoming more and more common. But the tone is not only worrying when it comes to political discourse, but it is also true of the way some seek to shut down debate altogether by targeting media and journalists. Europe must always be a place where freedom of press is possible and is not called into question. Too many of our journalists are intimidated, attacked, or even murdered.
il n'y a pas de démocratie
We cannot have democracy without free press.
Merci d'applaudir, comme ça je peux boire.
Thank you for your applause. That gives me an opportunity to drink.
En général, try again. D'une façon générale,
In general, ladies and gentlemen, we must revive the lost art of compromise. Compromise does not mean a weakness or a sacrificing of our convictions. And the Commission will resist any attack on the rule of law, and we continue to be very concerned by the developments in some of our member states. Article 7 must be applied whenever the rule of law is threatened.
à cet égard, le Premier vice
First Vice President Timmermans is doing a remarkable job of defending the rule of law, but all too often he stands alone in defending the rule of law. And the whole Commission and I personally support him fully.
Et puis, il y a un point sur lequel
And then there is one point on which we have to be very clear, that is, the judgments from the Court of Justice, which must be respected and implemented. The European Union is a community of law, and respecting the rule of law and abiding by court decisions are not an option, but an obligation. Mr. President, honourable members of the European Parliament, friends, I started this speech, it won't be my last speech, but it's my last State of the Union address, by talking about history, which in a small way covers our mandate and of course in a wider sense covers our time here. And we are all responsible for the Europe of today, and we must all take responsibility for the Europe of tomorrow. Such is history. Parliaments and commissions come and go. Europe is here to stay. But for Europe to become what it must, there are several lessons to be learned. Europe can no longer be a spectator or a mere commentator of international events. Europe must be an active player and must become an architect of tomorrow's world. There is a strong demand for Europe throughout the world, and to meet such high demand, Europe will have to speak with one voice on the world stage. And amongst nations, Europe's voice must be heard clearly. Federica Mogherini has made Europe's diplomacy more coherent. It's more coherent than it's ever been. But let us not slide back into the incoherence of competing and parallel national diplomacies. Europe's diplomacy must be conducted in the singular. And from now on in, I would like us to make more efforts to bring together the East and West of Europe. It is time we put an end to the sorry spectacle of a divided Europe. Our continent and those who brought an end to the Cold War deserve better. I would like the European Union to take better care of its social dimension too. Those who ignore the legitimate concerns of workers and small businesses are putting our society at risk, and it is time that we proclaimed the Gothenburg Social Summit into law. I would like for next year's elections to be a landmark for European democracy. I would like to see the Spitzenkandidaten process repeated, which is a small step forward for European democracy. For me, this process will be made more credible once we have transnational lists, and I hope that that will be in place for the elections in 2024. But above all, I would like us to say no to unhealthy nationalism and to say yes to enlightened patriotism. We should never forget that the patriotism of the 21st century is twofold, both European and national, and they are not mutually exclusive. As the French philosopher Blaise Pascal said, I like things that go together. In order to stand on its own 2 feet, Europe and its nations must move forward as one. To love Europe is to love its nations. To love your nation is to love Europe. Patriotism is a virtue. Unchecked nationalism is both riddled with poison and deceit.
En un mot, restons fidèles.
In short, we must remain true to ourselves. The trees we plant today must provide shade for our great-grandchildren, whether they come from the east or the west, the south or the north, to give them all they need to grow and breathe easily. A few years ago, standing in this very same spot, I told you that Europe was the love of my life. I love Europe still and shall do so forever. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, President Jean-Claude. During the course of your speech, you've offered us a range of pointers. You've set out some prospects. In the coming debate, we'll be able to strengthen some of the positions. I believe that Parliament, in the final spurt of this parliamentary term, will be able to confirm a number of the items still in the pipeline. As you've said, we cannot allow ourselves to be made scapegoats. Perhaps scapegoats will be found elsewhere. We're at the heart of democracy. So I would urge us to start by thinking, for example, about the need for Parliament to have the power of legislative initiative. We're the only parliament in the world which lacks that power to take the legislative initiative. You quite rightly underscored, and this was welcomed by a round of applause, the need for majority voting. When we're dealing with migration, the Commission's proposal and the Parliament's proposal on the Dublin reform could be adopted by the Council by a majority vote, but there's always resistance. If that reform were passed, we wouldn't have had the Juncker case in Italy. So having welcomed that proposal with massive applause that we move to qualified voting, I assume there will be support for that initiative. And then all your initiatives regarding Africa are of great interest. They're heading in the right direction, in line with Parliament's wishes. We've called for a fund for Africa. Perhaps Europe has finally woken up very late in the day on the migration agenda. We're listening. If we'd listened to the appeals from a number of countries and groups a few years ago, we mightn't be where we are today. Significant investment is required, as you quite rightly say. We don't want a policy where we're just handing out gifts. We need development, economic diplomacy. This is a job that needs to be worked on swiftly, and Parliament will do its part. Parliament wants to play a leading role. We'll be taking the final vote. Our representatives, as you'll see in our resolutions, are speaking out to defend the rights of the 3.5 million EU citizens living in the United Kingdom. As for economic and monetary union, we need a stronger commitment on our part, because unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, has to be the main social issue we address. In the European Parliament, President, we'll be working intensively in the remaining months to come up with palpable responses for our citizens. In my capacity as President of Parliament, I'll use my best endeavours to ensure that our institution is ever closer to our citizens. The first speaker on behalf of the European People's Party is Manfred Weber.
Dear President, dear Commission President, dear colleagues, Europe is much more robust than 4 years ago. We overcame tough times. I think everybody can underline this. But without you, Jean-Claude, without your leadership, it would have been impossible to manage the last years. With your cool head, your determination and your sincere heart for Europe, you defended the unity of this continent, and I want to thank you for this. And also I want to thank you for the details of your love affair, which you shared with us in your final remarks. Thank you, Jean-Claude Juncker. But there is still a lot to do, and that is the main message of today's State of the Union speech. We are in a working session still. We have to deliver. And with today's announcements of Jean-Claude Juncker and the Commission, we can sum up that all the proposals the Commission promised at the beginning of their mandate are now on the table of Parliament and Commission. And I would also add, these were not only the proposals of the Commission at the beginning, that were the promises of the EPP candidate Jean-Claude Juncker in his election campaign. So to give a clear link between what you promised in the campaign last year and what you delivered under your leadership in the Commission. And also on the implementing part, we have to be aware that we delivered a lot. You mentioned already some of the figures which are on the table. On economy, stable growth rate, all the countries of the Eurozone below 3%. We have created a lot of millions of new jobs. Our companies did so. Mario Draghi gave now a clear signal that he will stop and finish the low interest rate policy until the end of this year. So having this in mind, it is a big success story. We have the Brexit. I can remember, Jean-Claude, when we were in your office after we got the messages from London about the outcome of the referendum, and we were disappointed. We were looking for answers, and we were a little bit scared about could others probably follow? Will others probably follow? Today, Europe is united and ready for a deal, but London cannot give us a clear answer, so the EU is united and London is in trouble. And finally, on migration, we reduced the numbers of arrivals, especially through the Mediterranean route, about more than 80% till 2015. So when you sum up all these things, some would probably say this listing up all the success stories is a boring exercise, and probably journalists are not so much interested. I would say it's not the case. I would say it is a precondition for the most important thing a politician can have, and that is trust from the people. We did it together. All the political families worked on this. I want to pick up only one aspect, because there is still a discussion going on how we rescued the euro. And yes, my party, the EPP party, is proud about what we did. It is about the policy of Enda Kenny, of Pascal Coelho, of Mariano Rajoy, of Samaras and of Anastasiadis in Cyprus. They did the necessary steps, and we rescued Europe and the euro with the policy we invented and we established. And we created growth and a good perspective for the future perspective of the people. And I cannot remember, let me say this on party political terms, I cannot remember that Hollande, Renzi, Dijsselbloem or even Moscovici presented any kind of an alternative proposal to how we should answer the challenge which was on the table. Dear colleagues, even Mr. Bullmann in the German government, with your contribution, with your party, I didn't see any alternative proposal to present other strategies to overcome the crisis. Stable budgets and an ambitious reform programme are necessary for a good economic future. That is what the EPP believes in. But now let's look to the future. A Europe of people is first of all a Europe of security. That's why we welcome the proposal to present 10,000 Frontex officers to really contribute to a strong border control. Security means also still the fight against organised crime and criminals. Their data exchange is key for Europe, and I also want to underline that the Schengen area brings more security and not less security, and that's why we ask the Council to take further steps to include Bulgaria and Croatia inside of the Schengen area. They have waited for such a long time. It's now time to act. And I ask the Romanian government to stop the risks about the fight against corruption in Romania, because they are harming the decision-making process towards Bulgaria and Croatia in the same way. All three countries must have the right to join the Schengen area immediately. I want to underline this again. A second point for a Europe of people is a Europe of democracy, and that's why I thank you for the initiatives to make our European elections safe. Not Russia, not China, not any external power will decide, not trolls, not fake news, not Cambridge Analytica will decide, the people will decide, the Europeans will decide about the future of this continent. A third point for a Europe of people is a Europe of fairness. I am considering what a truck driver is thinking when he is listening to the radio and they talk about the self-driving trucks. I think he is asking himself, what will happen to me? In such a world, we are standing in front of a revolution on the labour market. In such a world, we have to create a new fair deal for Europe, and that means, and I think we share all in this House the general ideas, fair taxation, to contributions of the digital business sector to the future of this fair approach of a new social model. And today's Europe cannot be united, cannot be called united, having in mind that still the living conditions in the European Union are not equal. That's why I think we have to do more on common living conditions and living standards in the European Union. And finally, Europe of people is a Europe which is strong on global level. You showed in the Oval Office that we are strong, economically a giant, and we have to become also politically a giant. And that's why to change from the unanimous vote mechanism to the majority vote system is fully supported by the EPP. Let's stand up. Let's make the century a European one again. Crisis times are over. Now it's time for a more united Europe, for a more democratic Europe, and for a more ambitious Europe. Thank you so much.
On behalf of the Socialist and Democrats group, Udo Bullmann has the floor.
President of the Commission, you started the mandate by promising that you will be a politician, a political leader of the college. And even those who tend to criticize you on a daily basis, as I do, of course only if it's really necessary, have to admit you are a political leader of the European Commission. Chapeau. You are not the porte-parole of the national capitals, and you are paying tribute to the decency of this political role in Europe. By doing so, you are making a huge difference to the predecessor of your own political family, which I appreciate. But this is not the issue at stake today. The issue is not whether you or whether the college consists of dedicated Europeans. We are convinced of that, otherwise we would have not voted for you. The very question at stake is whether or not our institution, our policies are already fit, are already up to the task on which we have to deliver in these days. Yes, we are in an era of huge crisis. Manfred Weber, I do not think that we already have overcome crisis. Think of migration, you mentioned it. Think on climate change. Think of deepening divides between North and South and East and West. No, we are in transformational periods, and to put it in the words of Pope Francis at the beginning of your mandate, he said, this is not an era of change, this is a change of the era. And the very question which we discuss in our political group is, why can't we go more radical? Why can't we go for a more clearer policy change to live up to that. Migration. You mentioned it, and we fully-hearted support what you were saying. What takes me wonder, Manfred Weber was reminding us on the fact that you were the PPE candidate for the last competition. Why is it that once you are talking about migration, you only have the applause of the left side of this House and all the others are silent? I am wondering why is that, and I cannot understand, because what he says is the task of today. Yes, we have to open legal ways for migration. It's a scandal. We say it's a scandal what we witnessed again in this summer in the Mediterranean. It's disgusting to see people drowning, even that the official mission of the European Union does not have any safe harbours anymore because of the Italian government, the right-wing Italian government. And this is the mission of the Commission's president, who was the EPP candidate for the last decision-making for this mandate. So please take note of that when you are going to prepare the summit in September 19th and discuss his proposals and come to urgent action. This is what we expect from the Council. Friends, we will only be able to put it in a broader picture if we reach out to the societies of the East. Yes, they need a new compact. They have an interest beyond Bratislava, Jean-Claude Juncker, beyond Bratislava. They have a dear interest in safe energy. They have an interest in cohesion, long-lasting cohesion, and in re-industrialization of their countries. And they deserve it. The workers in the East countries deserve a decent future. And we have to set up a new compact. And I'm deeply convinced that then it will be easier to also solve the migration question. Let us talk about the South. It is not bearable that 50% of the young people in the South are without any perspective. We have to set up a new master plan for the South. Why not? This could be done by the Commission in the last months of this mandate. Why not propose a new master plan building on the investment plan of Jean-Claude Juncker, extending that to the South and giving back future and hope to the southern countries, and to make them again the marketplaces of new ideas, the bridge builders to the cultures that are in our neighbourhood. That would be a very important task, and we would encourage you to do so. But it's not only the societies in the East and the South that are falling apart. Look at the North. Look at Brexit. We back, of course, the position totally of the Commission, and we stand united on that. But look at Brexit. Look at the Swedish elections, and you see that ordinary people, that working class people who have invested their hope on Europe would like to see us delivering on top of our agenda one proposal. Why does the Commission not come forward with the proposal that each and every child in the European Union has a child guarantee, deserves free healthcare, deserves proper education, deserves decent housing? That could be a proposal of the next forthcoming months to unite the European Union for a new future of the next generation. This is what we propose. You are right, we need the defence of our institution. We need to fight against our enemies who would like to undermine our democracy, Cambridge Analytica, all the enemies from the outside as well as the enemies from the inside. And yes, we need to strengthen the community method. For the last months of your mandate, good luck, bon courage.
On behalf of the European Conservatives and Reformists, Mr. Legutko has the floor.
Mr. President, it was a very interesting speech. I expect it would be more of a summing up speech, and I was just wondering what will be the proportion between pluses and minuses. Of course, on the plus side, I would put the Juncker plan, which you mentioned en passant, but I think which was has been a success. But there is also a minus side to it. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is of course immigration and demographic crisis. Of course, you did not do it directly. It was Chancellor Merkel who opened the European borders, but you could have prevented her, at least try to prevent her. I don't know with what effect, but at least you could have. Now, we can, of course, subscribe to the idea of strengthening European borders, but I think it's a somewhat belated proposal. I mean, we could have talked about it some time ago. Instead, we spent a couple of years on imposing the solution that was absurd from the very beginning, the mandatory relocation. And there was a lot of energy spent on it, a lot of blood was shed, and the typical share of bullying and invectives were thrown around. So, but the real question is that you should ask yourself, and we all should ask ourselves, is the European Union in a better shape now than it was when you took office? And I think the answer is clear. No. With all due respect, President Juncker, and all the successes that you had, no. There has never been a time in the history of European integration where Europe was more disunited than it is now. You talked about unity. No, the unity is no longer there. It doesn't mean World War I or World War II. Until recently, integration was one-way street. Now it's two-way street. The number of people who are dissatisfied, deeply dissatisfied with the European project is increasing. That's why our colleagues, my colleagues too, are somewhat nervous before the elections, because they do not know what will happen. They are afraid of a possible political earthquake. And you cannot say that the European Commission has no share in it and no responsibility. There is at least political responsibility. I mean, come on, there is some relation between cause and effect. It's not the fact that there are so many people who have been antagonized, made angry, irritated, marginalized, bullied, rejected. The number is so high that you cannot neglect it, and you cannot decline any responsibility for that. You, not as a person, but you as a chief of the important European institution. So I would say that we have to somehow roll back this process. When you mentioned that you wanted to have qualified majority votes in more areas of policy, public life in Europe, I mean, you are in for more trouble, because that will petrify this system in which some actors are equal and some are more equal than others, in which the decision-making process is extremely obscure. Nobody knows who makes the decision. And the division between North and South, East and West, is still there. So if you want to have more trouble, go along this path. And this will be an extremely interesting situation after the election. I mean, to what extent you will be responsive to the signals. You are a charming man, President Juncker, and I love listening to you. But when you were talking today, I thought, my God, we are living in two different worlds. I wonder which one is the true one.
On behalf of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe, Mr. Verhofstadt has the floor.
I just want to react to Mr. Legutko. It's terrifying what he is saying. He's saying here that we were never so disunited as today, as he has forgotten what Europe was between the two world wars, as he has forgotten what Europe was in the Cold War. You have never heard about the wall and the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain? Europe is united now. It's not Mr. Legutko. It's not Mr. Legutko. You have another vision. You say I'm of another world than Mr. Juncker. Well, very well. For me, no problem. But doesn't say things that are completely crazy in a continent that has seen 20 million of deaths and victims because of nationalism and populism, as you defend it today. That's the point. And I have to tell you, I didn't want to start, Jean-Claude, with this, but I find it so terrifying that somebody gives us here lessons about unity in Europe and then trying with his government to do against the rule of law, against a number of other things that are against European values. Sorry. But I want to applaud, sorry. But I didn't want to start. I wanted to start with applaud the State of the Union of Jean-Claude Juncker. And especially a part that nobody has talked about until now in the interventions, and is the part on Africa, Jean-Claude. Because you're right, I think. You have done a clear proposal. They don't need charity. What they need is a true partnership between us and we. And I think it's possible to create what I call the biggest economic and trade area in the world. Because if Europe does that with Africa, it will become and is already the biggest trade area. And it will also, in my opinion, be a true alternative for Africa, for the African citizens, for the African people, to the takeover by the Chinese, what is happening every day, every week, in every investment today in Africa. So I think that this Parliament has to support you in this goal. The question for me is a little bit different than the question of the other groups' leaders. The question is, last year, you gave us your legacy. You repeated it this year. And the question is, can we put that into reality in the coming years, this legacy of you? That's the question. In this existential year of elections, with a number of threats, let's be honest, the rise of nationalists, populists is everywhere in Europe. We have a number of authoritarian leaders. Yeah, thank you. To support me, like Mr. Kaczynski, like Mr. Orban, who are in fact hijacking our European parties. I think they do a little bit what Trump is doing in the Republican Party. But let's be honest, then your voice is only an affirmation of this. The inconvenient truth is that the alt-right in Europe is trying to undermine this European Union and is in fact trying to take over the European politics from within, and to do exactly the opposite than the agenda that Jean-Claude Juncker has presented us today. And for that reason, I think, and I think that everybody of us, certainly Manfred is aware of this, that in a few moments the vote we're going to have, it's so important that all pro-Europeans are united against this alt-right authoritarian tendency that we see in a number of our countries. Because leading the European Union, dear friends, is not only a question of mathematical strength, it's also a question of moral authority. And this moral authority is at stake for the moment in the European Union. Then, in the same spirit, Mr. Juncker, I want to ask you a specific thing for the Commission that you mentioned very shortly, but I want to go more in detail. I want to ask that the Commission in the coming months would introduce a package of proposals, specific proposals and specific measures to protect our elections against the foreign meddling that we have already seen in other continents and in other places in Europe. Identifying, for example, foreign agents who are active on the European social media platforms, as well as the extremist politicians with whom they are colluding. In the US, in the United States, there has been a special counsel appointed, as you all know, Robert Mueller, to investigate into the Russian interference in elections. and they have already launched dozens of indictments that will be handed down. Well, I think we need to catch up as fast as possible by also establishing our own special prosecutor to investigate and to stop all disinformation also in Europe, and certainly before it is too late in the light of the European elections we will have next year. And my special request to you, if the Commission could take an initiative to this and to bring it to the table of the Council and to the table of the European Parliament. And then finally, my last point, I want to support you in one thing. I think that the most important point of your intervention was the point that you have made about the end of the use, or better, the end of unanimity and the use of the clause de passerelle. It's a French word. It was the most important proposal. And my proposal is, Jean-Claude, be ambitious. Put all fields, all articles of the treaty that are possible in your proposal of the clause de passerelle. Because I'm pretty sure that at the other side of the table in the Council, there will be a number of them who will not be in agreement with you. And it's all based, the best thing to ask the maximum as possible in politics. Start with 100%. Say, I want the end of unanimity inside the European Union. Because it's the main problem for the moment to decide a number of things. For example, the migration package, Mr. President, as you have mentioned, where the Council is not capable even to decide, even when it is with a qualified majority. So my proposal is, be ambitious, put the whole package in it. All fields of foreign policy, all fields, for me taxation also. Put everything in it. And we will see what will be the end game if we support you. You have said, and that will be my conclusion, that this was in fact the Commission of the last chance. You remember that, 4 years ago. And I'm always asking myself, what can come after the Commission of the last chance in the coming years? So I think what will come is something different. The Commission that we need in the future, dear colleagues, will be more than that. It will be a type of a new, renewed European government, what we need. With one task, that is to realise further the legacy of Jean-Claude Juncker. And also the other visions that have been laid down the latest months, for example, by the French President in his Sorbonne speech. That will be the task of this new Commission. And that is also the task we will offer to the electorate, as our group, as our movement, as a real European alternative on your legacy towards the nationalist and the populist inside and outside of this House. Thank you.
Per il gruppo.
Now, on behalf of the Greens EFA Group, Ska Keller has the floor.
Thank you, President. You yourself and many colleagues have looked at the challenges that we have globally, and I totally agree with them. We have a lot of challenges. We have problems, to say the least, in our transatlantic partnership. We have China rising up. There's so many challenges out there. But I would argue that more threatening than anything that the world can throw at us are actually the enemies from the inside. And they are the obvious ones, the nationalists that bring hatred, division, the racists that spread fear and hate. But there's also some less obvious. It's the decision makers that actually don't take decisions, that want to keep the status quo, who just want to keep their own privileges and who are just closing their eyes at what's at stake. And then there's parties and governments, of which unfortunately we have more and more, who use the European Union as a scapegoat for all their own failures and that are cutting away for democracy and civil liberties, bit by bit and piece by piece. But a Europe united, a Europe that knows what it stands for, can face all external problems and can be a front runner and a shining example in the world. We can be strong if we don't make ourselves weak. And Europe has promised to its citizens to bring peace, prosperity and democracy. And those promises are still very relevant, but we need to renew them and we need to bring them to fulfilment. And on peace we have major achievements to show, but we cannot rest on laurels and Norwegian medals. There are new global challenges ahead that threaten our future and that threaten our security. And the biggest one of them is climate change. We have seen it this summer that climate change is happening. It's happening now, and it's happening everywhere. From disastrous harvests to forest fires, there's no way anyone could possibly deny that. And the good news about climate change is that we know what to do. And the bad news about climate change is that we don't do it. But with Trump leading the US into space rather than forward, we cannot wait as Europeans for someone else to protect our planet. No, we have to do it ourselves, and there's no time to lose. And there the Commission has been way too timid in the past 5 years, I have to say. It is now that we need a very quick change to renewables and phasing out of the climate killer coal. And if climate protection truly is a priority, then it should also be a priority in the multiannual budget. It should also be a priority in the agricultural reform. And agriculture is both a victim as well as a culprit in climate change. But farmers can also be part of the solution. And here is where the Commission should have been more ambitious with the agricultural reform. The European Union has also always promised prosperity, but we are far away from the AAA rating that we should have, I agree, on social policies. And the austerity imposed on member states in the past without regards to consequences and also without regards to whether this would actually help anything, that has seriously undermined the European promise of increasing living standards. But increasing the quality of life, that's not just some minor thing that you can forget about. It's an essence of policy making. And we need to renew this promise and build a social Europe. And one not just of nice declarations like we've seen from Gothenburg. We need not just nice intentions, that's all very nice, but we need a social Europe with real facts and real figures. We need common minimum social standards in Europe. All citizens must get full access to social protection, to housing and to medical care. A framework directive on adequate minimum income schemes can create such a safety net as well, and here it would be very interesting to see a proposal by the Commission so that we can ensure that safety net for everyone and not just for a lucky few. And Europe has promised democracy, rule of law and civil liberties to all its citizens. And that was a very strong call for all the countries that wanted to join, for all the people living under dictatorships who were being deprived from freedoms, like the country where I myself was born. And our continent has a long and bloody history of oppressions, of tanks rolling against protesters, of people suffering in prison camps. And it's only thanks to those courageous people who were marching for freedom, who were marching for democracy, who did not give up, that today in the European Union we have that democracy, we have those civil liberties, and we have freedom. But those very big successes, they are under threat. And we need to fight for them again every single day. Because inside Europe, today, judges are being dismissed, corruption is being legalised, newspapers are closed, universities harassed, and civil society treated as criminals. And this is not a detail. This is a threat to all of us. And again, today as well, courageous people are standing up, marching for human rights, their own rights and the rights of their neighbours, and they're marching for freedom, be it in Sicily or Romania, be it in Chemnitz or be it in Pirin. And they defend democracy, they defend humanity, and they defend Europe. And we see as well that if we stand up together, then we really have power. Then we are really strong together. And I think more now than ever, it is now the task and responsibility of all of us to take a stance, to take up all of our responsibilities. We have responsibilities, you as President of the Commission, we all as members of the European Parliament, but all Europeans from north to south, from east to west. Because if Europe loses on democracy, then it will lose itself. And this is about more than about one country or another country. This is about the achievements on this continent that so many people have even died for. This is about our true self, the true self of Europe, and it is time to take a stance. Thank you.
Please, we need to respect the timing. A nome del gruppo confederale.
On behalf of the Confederal Group of the European United Left and Nordic Green Left, Ms. Zimmer has the floor.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, President. Mr. Juncker, today I think you delivered a very intensive speech, giving your political position with which you have exercised the office of Commission President. I'd like to express my respect for that. I think it makes it easier for us to speak about what, from the point of view of the various political groups in the European Union, what should be different. I'd like to start with the evaluation of whether we are in a position where we can say we've got over the crisis. We're in a position where we are girded for all the challenges of the future, that we're prepared so that people have the feeling of social security, of solidarity, of a community in the European Union. I'm saying to you no very clearly. Yesterday, when the Greek Prime Minister was here, one sentence was very clear, very demonstrative. He said, "We're out of the memorandum. We've survived." When he says we've survived, if that's the result of a policy which has been shaped by the Union and the Commission, a sort of crisis management which is on the backs of the poorest, and has meant that inequality has become deeper, and that we don't have the safety, the security, that we can look to the future. We all have the feeling that in the upcoming elections there's something facing us where we can say today we have to deflect it because we want to have a Europe of solidarity, of peace, and there's a whole lot of issues where we have to say today's policies, it won't work like that. We have to see that 10 years after the start of the financial crisis, the level of prosperity of the pre-crisis era has not been reached in many countries, and people are not benefiting from growth. The rights of workers in many countries have been severely cut. We must give a signal that these rights and the protection of employees and those who are not in any job, that we get them back, that we strengthen them, that we accept that is part of it, part of being the European Union. And we don't want that the promised social AAA becomes a AAA for a future military strength of the European Union. It can't be that we're taking money from the European budget for the fund that you're talking about. The heading that you used, showing strength, and showing strength to the outside, and protecting citizens, and reminds me of the Austrian presidency. They're saying a Europe that protects, and they're making it very clear. It's not about a social union. It's not about that at all. There's no specific goal in the description of this presidency. It's about protecting the external borders and turning away refugees, and this humanitarian catastrophe that we've seen in the summer is being continued. I'm very thankful that you said where the problem lies and who is blocking. And I think that as a parliament we must make it very clear that we need Dublin, that we shouldn't accept that the Council is constantly blocking and they're simply descending into inactivity. The Commission, what you expect from the Commission, say this loud and clear. For activists and actors, they don't know where the causes lie, who they can turn to, who they can fight with together. If we don't know who is responsible for what responsibilities are borne by the individual institutions, we must make that very clear. Otherwise, we can't win over voters who can't get over this lethargy when it comes to fighting for Europe. We must tackle that together. There must be a mission, and then we'll differentiate ourselves in the left from all right-wing attempts to destroy Europe. I wanted to stress that. On behalf of the group of the EFTD, Mr. Farage has the floor.
What a picture you paint. A European Union of peace, of prosperity, of contentedness. And as you said, you're trying to make it a little more perfect every day. Well, it's a very good advertising slogan, but tell you what surprised me. Since your last State of the Union speech, there's been a seismic political event in Europe, perhaps one even on a par with Brexit. Italy, a founding member of the Union, the third biggest economy in the Eurozone, now has a coalition government between the Five Stars and Lega that is polling over 60% of the vote and is posing a direct challenge, both in terms of the management of the Eurozone and indeed how the migration crisis is handled. You made no acknowledgement of that at all. No acknowledgement of the populist revolt that is sweeping through virtually every single member state. Instead, you're to carry on regardless. And I noted your continued use of the phrase sovereign Europe. What you're talking about is a deeper centralisation of power, a centralisation of power in terms of Europe's foreign policy, a centralisation of power, as you first laid out last year, in terms of building a European army, more power at the centre for taxation. All of this, of course, meaning less to be done at the nation-state level. And now, another 10,000 European border guards paving the way for a federal border police in Europe. Well, I tell you something, if you've got problems with the Italians now, you ain't seen nothing yet when you put that proposal to them. But it's all about centralisation. Power, power, power. But here's the funny thing. You appealed to our sense of European patriotism. So why is it that patriotism at the nation-state level is considered to be insular, bad, nasty, xenophobic, probably racist into the bargain? And yet, patriotism at a European level is a good and a virtuous thing. And I'm afraid this idea of European patriotism, this idea of putting that flag above their own nation-state flag, is for the birds. People do not have a profound sense of European identity. They have a sense of national identity. And in a way, that is the great dividing line between your vision of Europe and that, increasingly, that has been said by the electors. We wish to live in nation states. Now, on Brexit, Mr Juncker, on the Irish border, already there are huge differences between the north and the south, differences of politics, of tax, of currency and of law, and we manage. And if we can get to a free trade deal, well, of course, there'll be no difficulties whatsoever. And I thought you had some very positive things to say. You said our vote to leave was a vote to leave the single market and its associated parts. I agree with you. Quite why Mrs May at Chequers wants to opt back into much of it, I don't know. But you said twice that we need to come to a free trade deal. It's what European exporters want. And it is, absolutely. And it's what we want. Surely now the time is right. The ground is prepared for a Canada Plus style trade deal between you and between us. We leave political union, but we carry on doing business on a tariff-free basis. We want it. Increasingly, I think that you want it. Let's get Brexit sorted. And, Mr Verhofstadt, you'll be happy. You'll see the back of us.
On behalf of the Europe of Nations and Freedoms group, Mr Bay has the floor. Mr Juncker, 4 years after your Commission came into office, and less than a year before the European elections, we have to take stock. And clearly, you are, in the Commission, a condensed form of everything that the people of Europe can no longer stand. Your Commission's action is opaque, anti-democratic and unclear. It's opaque when you decide by executive fiat to appoint Mr Zellmeyer as Secretary General of the Commission. You, Mr Juncker, flouted all the rules. It's against democracy when Commissioner Oettinger, in an extraordinarily arrogant statement said that the financial market would teach the Italians the proper way to vote. And it's also against democracy when just now you stated that the EU budget would be pinned down up to 2027 without waiting to see what are say in the elections May next year. And you've been punitive towards Poland and Hungary. We saw a fine example of a Stalinesque show trial just yesterday, just because they've been brave enough to stand up for the values of our civilization, and they refuse the compulsory quotas of migrants that you've wanted to impose on them. You've also been punitive towards the British. You want to make them pay the price of their freedom by refusing any sort of trade agreement with them. When we have countries who are not in the EU, such as Norway and Iceland, who have access to the single market, and you're increasing this welter of trade agreements all around the world, you're going to refuse that to the British? And of course, the work of your Commission has been characterised by the way you sped up the dismantlement of any kind of economic protection. You've been encouraging unfair competition within Europe with the posting of workers, and with the wider world with free trade agreements with a severe impact on the environment, undermining our industry, our farming industry. It applies to CETA and future agreements with Oceania, and off you went to Turkey the other day without the opinion or let alone any input from the European Parliament or the national parliaments to sign up to a prior agreement on free trade with Japan. And I see, of course, your Commission has been characterised by its crazy migration policy. Our colleague Mr. Legutko just now underscored the point very moderately, yet nonetheless he found Mr. Verhofstadt striking him down with a thunderbolt, attacking populists. But within this chamber, he is the picture of hatred of any different thinking from his own. We've just seen another demonstration of that. Your Commissioner Avramopoulos talked about migration, saying that you are gearing towards accepting migrants as something that's vital for our continent's socio-economic future. And you've talked about increasing illegal migration even more. That is undoubtedly your greatest political folly. You've made it possible for people to organise this mass immigration which is weakening our continent and leading to the suffering of our peoples. The President. The next speaker is Mr. Uzajdowski, a non-attached member.
Panie Przewodniczący, koleżanki I koledzy.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I want to start by thanking President Juncker for his speech. I appreciate your pragmatism, your principle that it is better to be efficient and effective in small matters and careful in big matters, contrary to the socialists who demand financing of new jobs from the European level. So I appreciate your pragmatism. But what I missed in your speech is supporting our free market. I missed in your speech calls for doing away with protectionism in Europe and supporting of small and medium-sized enterprises. Contrary to Mr. Farage, who took the floor maybe 3 minutes before me, I would be in favour of Europe taking more responsibility for our defence policy. I have been watching this process with a great interest. I think Europe should share with the US responsibility for our defence. But this needs practical solidarity. Europeans must feel that Europe will defend Eastern Europe with the same vigour that with which it defends Southern Europe, and that Europe would not tolerate counterproductive initiative like Nord Stream 2. Thank you.
Signor Presidente della Commissione, lei...
President of the Commission, during the course of your speech, you reminded us of the role of journalists as people who uphold the state of law. Once again, I would like to remind the House that the murderers of two journalists, Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was murdered in Malta, and Jan Kuciak, murdered in Slovakia, have still not been found. Until such time as we establish who hired them, we will continue to speak out against the course of events. President Juncker has the floor.
President, ladies and gentlemen, I'll make some remarks very briefly and address some specific points that have been put to me. Mr. Bullmann, first of all, who drew our attention on the need to develop the rights of children and social rights more generally. I'd like to point out that the Commission has proposed within the Gothenburg process an action of that type, action Chapter 3, number 11. I'd like to say to Mr. Keller that today and yesterday I pleaded that the Gothenburg Declaration should be implemented into and become action, and including legislative action. To Mr. Hofstadt, the Commission is proposing a text on the protection of European candidates for the European elections. All that's well advanced. To Mr. Farage, that you have to listen before you speak. I did not put national patriotism and European patriotism on the same footing. I said that one doesn't exclude the other. I will continue to be a patriot, but an enlightened patriot, not a small, grand, ducal patriot. I like my country, but I don't detest the others. And if you say, in a different world, it's not Mr. Farage who said it, but a previous speaker, yes. I don't want to live in this world made of hatred. I don't want to live in that world. I'd like to make it mine and yours. Thank you.
Grazie. La parola a nome del Consiglio.
Thank you. Now, on behalf of the Council, Ms. Edstadler has the floor.
President Juncker, President Tajani, honourable members, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Council, let me first of all thank President Juncker for his address and for his analysis regarding the challenges, but also the opportunities facing our Union at this crucial juncture as we approach the end of the legislature. I won't be able to go into all the detailed elements of President Juncker's speech, and his considerations deserve a careful examination. Obviously, he touched upon issues that are at the centre of our attention. But let me turn to something else at the outset. I would like to stress that I fully second what President Juncker stated at the beginning of his speech. Our Union is a union of peace. It is a union of prosperity, and we should show respect towards this union, deal with it carefully, and protect our common values. Now let me turn to some issues touched. For instance, the idea of further strengthening Frontex. It is an important element of a functioning EU policy on migration. It was already discussed at the European Council in June, and it will be a main topic for the discussions at the informal Heads of State or Government Summit in Salzburg. And yes, the strengthening of Frontex is, in our view, a precondition to establish a resilient and well-based European asylum system. We hope to find as much as possible a common ground and to bring things forward. The European Council in June also reconfirmed the necessity of bringing our cooperation with Africa to a new level. A visible expression of this aim will be a high-level forum which we are currently planning to hold in Vienna at the beginning of December. And as far as the proposal on summertime is concerned, we are planning to put that very quickly on the agenda of the Council. Given the specific political context before the end of the current legislative term, there is indeed a need to concentrate on the delivery of pending proposals and on the effective implementation of legislation. Be assured that the Austrian presidency's energy and determination is fully focused on this. In recent months, there have been developments which may on surface seem contradictory. There is much talk about Euroscepticism and concerns in this respect ahead of next year's election of the European Parliament. Yet, at the same time, we have seen positive signs on renewed trust and higher levels of support for the Union. For our part, as presidency, we are confident that there is enough unity and determination in Europe to tackle these challenges ahead and to transfer them into opportunities. Our motto is a Europe that protects, and this is what we try to contribute. I think this motto could also apply to a series of elements of President Juncker's speech today. Europe has emerged stronger in many ways from the crisis we have faced in recent years. But now we need to act swiftly and determinedly on the economy, on migration, on security and on digital Europe. Especially cybercrime, the increasing number of cyber attacks and the crucial questions on cybersecurity must be discussed diligently. We will strive to use the efforts of digitalisation on the one hand at its best, and on the other hand, we have to deal carefully with the possible negative effects. The goal must be a secure, stable, single digital market and the highest trust of its consumers, of the civils of Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, addressing you in this hemicycle in July, Chancellor Kurz presented to you the priorities of our presidency, namely security and the fight against illegal migration, securing prosperity and competitiveness through digitalisation and stability in the European neighbourhood. I will not go through these principles and priorities again. They focus on achieving tangible results through demonstrating to European citizens the EU's indispensable added value for its citizens and member states. And of course, this is particularly important in this period as we near the end of the legislature. As President Juncker mentioned, we have a lot of work to do in the coming months in terms of legislation, but there are of course also the informal meetings of the head of state or government in Salzburg next week, and the European Council meetings in October and in December, in which crucial decisions will have to be made. And beyond our presidency, the European election, of course, and the informal meeting in Sibiu in May 2019, when the implementation of the leaders' agenda will be reviewed and the strategic agenda for the period 2019 to 2024 will be prepared. Ladies and gentlemen, finally, speaking of delivering on priority policies, I would also note that today's debate on the State of the Union is a key moment in a new annual cycle of programming. Now, the General Affairs Council at its meeting on 18 September will have an exchange of views on the basis of the Commission's letter of intent, which was issued only yesterday. We also look forward to continuing the fruitful dialogue among the three institutions on priorities, particularly on implementation of the joint declaration on the EU's legislative priorities for 2018 and 2019. Delivering results can be achieved in a focused and targeted way through our joint programming. Let me reaffirm the Council's commitment to this process and assure you that the Presidency will continue to be a determined partner. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, State Secretary Ed Stadler. We now move to our speakers list. The first to speak is Mr. Caspary, 1.5 minutes.
Sehr geehrter Herr Kommissionspräsident, geschätzte
Mr. President of the Commission, dear colleagues, President Juncker put it nicely. The European Union today, politically, economically and socially, is doing a lot better than people think. That said, there are still a lot of challenges ahead. Many people are concerned or are unhappy. And often these concerns and this unhappiness stems from the fact that people have expectations of the EU which we can't meet. They have expectations which member states don't equip us to meet. And the European Union doesn't have sufficient competence to deal with it either. Now, we need to deal with tax breaks for companies such as Apple and Amazon. We need a stronger foreign policy. We want to protect our external borders and deal with migration. But if we want to tackle all of those issues, then we find that member states have not devolved competence for this to us, and that we therefore can't deal with these issues. We would lend full support to the European Commission and representative of Council. I hope that the Council takes up these proposals made by Mr. Juncker so that these issues are discussed in Council and so that finally the European Union will be in a position to meet the expectations of its citizens so that they are content with the EU and so that this project can be successful and work to the benefit of our citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. 2.5 minutes, Madam Rodrigues.
O Presidente da Comissão Europeia.
The President of the Commission has just presented to us an agenda geared towards the future. The agenda of a true European politician. It is indeed the case that the time for European sovereignty has arrived. In response to climate change, digitalisation and trade, there's a need to find a different way of governing migratory flows. Well, why are we not making progress with this agenda? The reason for that is that we face forces from the past who are arguing that it's better to protect our citizens just behind national borders. That's completely illusory. Because today it's not possible to protect your citizens solely on the basis of national policies. You need Europe-wide solutions. The real reason why we're not making headway with this agenda is that we face the forces protecting the status quo, conservative forces who resist the enforcement of these Europe-wide solutions. For them, the issue of migration merely requires a well-organised European border, but progressive forces have to make the case that that's not enough. You need a real partnership with Africa. You need a European-wide response when it comes to hosting refugees and protecting them. There's a feeling that it's amongst conservative forces that it's positive that the economy is recovering, but progressive forces feel that we need much more. We have to have the energy shift and push the economy in the right direction. But there's a great blockage here. Mr. Weber is satisfied with the current position, but it's just not possible. The Eurozone will continue to be characterised by divergences and until we have a proper common budget policy. Conservative forces think it's enough to have jobs. It's not enough. The quality of jobs has to be regarded as a true social pillar with a contract which will provide proper protection for all European citizens. This can only be achieved when progressive forces manage to overcome those defending the status quo who have been posing obstacles in the course of true European solutions.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Solé.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Mr. Juncker has enlightened us about the need to defend European values against chauvinist nationalism, and I couldn't agree more. But I'd like to make him a suggestion. Please go to Catalonia and visit our 9 political prisoners, amongst them 2 former MEPs. Please go and have a chat with them about the core values and founding principles of the European Union. And after having discussed with them, ask yourself, what are these people, these democratic, peaceful and pro-European people, doing in jail? Ask yourself if having politicians and civil society leaders in jail for nearly a year without trial on the basis of fake accusations, just for having organised a referendum, just for having implemented a democratic mandate, if all this is according to European values. Yesterday, over 1 million people in Barcelona again claiming for our democratic rights, standing up for European values, against repression, and people convinced, despite feeling let down by European institutions, that Europe needs to be part of the solution.
Thank you. Mr. Omarjee, 1 minute, please.
Merci.
Thank you. I don't want to be unjust with you. A lot has to do with your actions. The rich are thanking you because your commission will have been a chance for tax evasion, a chance for the lobbies and for Bayer and Monsanto, which can continue to poison people for years. It's an opportunity for what has happened to Greece and for all those who are bearing down on the common good. President Macron will thank you too for your encouragements for putting in place structural reforms, opening up to competition in railways, reform of pensions and dismantling workers' rights. President Juncker, Vice President Timmermans, I regret to say that if the rich say thank you, the people of Europe won't be thanking you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Moiten.
Frau Präsidentin, wir sprechen heute über die Lage der
Madam President, we're talking about the State of the Union today, and President Juncker has given us his vision of that, and he took a historical approach, but his analysis is wrong in its most basic points. For example, he said that the crisis had been overcome. That's not true. It's just been swept under the carpet, and the day will come that we will have to pay the consequences of that. Peace is also not as important as it was in the 20th century, and we have a migration policy which isn't working and which is being supported by this House, and that's a problem too. Then ever closer union as a policy really is outdated as member states are leaving, and obviously they haven't understood the warnings of Brexit. This Commission and this policy is now nearing its end, and that was clear from your speech to Mr. Juncker. If the EU is to be strong, it really should concentrate on a small number of core tasks and should leave sovereignty to member states. Unfortunately, with the events yesterday, with the presence of Mr. Orban, the opposite is happening.
Thank you very much, Madam President. It's very amusing how the first row is praising each other. You're not used to opposition, but have no fear. You don't fear each other. We all love Europe. There's no doubt about that. But what have we heard today? We haven't heard much from Jean-Claude Juncker. He used the word solidarity 6 times. But colleagues, solidarity isn't a one-way street. But we saw that yesterday in the debate on Hungary. A left wing, the left wing stressed that. What has become of the white paper in March 2017? We haven't heard anything about that. I can't go down a route where I don't know what direction I'm going in. It's very strange. Juncker knows that this migration crisis will change Europe sustainably. And we're just in the first stage. And it's very late. He's very late in coming with his proposals. And after a delay of 1 year, the crisis hasn't got any better.
Madam Dodds, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. Today, Mr. Juncker wanted to establish his legacy. But sadly, that legacy will be the loss of a member state, and more importantly, the loss of confidence in the European Union, as demonstrated by recent elections in Sweden, Italy and Germany, as well as a migration crisis that continues to cost lives. On Brexit, Mr. Juncker reaffirms his view that there should be no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. I agree. But he also reaffirms support for the Belfast Agreement. However, the EU backstop proposal ignores one of the core principles of that agreement, the principle of consent. Let me make it clear once again in this House. There can be no borders, and certainly not those imposed by the European Union, within the internal market of the United Kingdom or interference in its constitutional framework. Great Britain is Northern Ireland's largest marketplace, where we sell more than in the Republic of Ireland, the rest of Europe and the rest of the world put together. Equally, 70% of everything that comes into Northern Ireland for consumers or the manufacturing process comes from GB. Customs or regulatory barriers would put jobs and families at risk. Thank you.
Could I just say, if I give everyone that leeway, I'm in trouble, and you will be annoyed with me because votes will run late. So please be strict on your time. For 1.5 minutes now, Mr. Lewandowski.
Dziękuję. Jaki jest State of the Union?
Thank you very much. Well, what the State of the Union is, we shall find out during the election in May of 2019. People, our electorate, will tell us that by participating in the election or abstaining from it. The EU is not really about institutions, but is about what binds us, why we want to be together. The EU is about feeling we stand to gain together and not to lose. And I think we still have 9 months to make the verdict of our sovereign to be a voice of trust. And I hope the results of the election will be conform to the optimistic speech of Mr. Juncker. And on behalf of the Polish delegation in EPP, I want to thank Mr. Juncker for the service in favour of Europe. We know what to do, not adopt regulations which make people's lives more difficult. For some, the multi-annual EU budget is important. Not for all, because some prefer a small European budget. But for most, I think financial predictability is important. But whether people trust us or not, all this boils down to security, safety and security. This is important. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam Van Bremt.
Thank you. As you know, you never get a second chance to make a first impression, and in that sense you will never get a second chance to be the Commission of the last chance. And that's what you promised us when you started this legislature. And that ship has sailed, I have to say. We know now that the successor of Mr. Juncker, he will be the next Commission President of the last chance. And this time it might get really serious. Yesterday we saw the face of the anti-democrats, and we all know that sort of extremism in Europe is based on raising inequalities and the fact that our citizens, they fear the future for themselves and their children. This Commission promised us a triple A on social issues. What we have is a file of a lot of paper and nice words, but not the concrete measures to fight the inequalities. And you said you would tackle migration and make sure that we have good answers to that. and now everything is based on the fact that we need to defend our borders. And last but not least, you said we would be top for the climate change. We did some things in a good direction, but we lack the real ambition to have a sustainable future. Thank you very much, Madam.
Mr. Jadot, 1 minute.
Monsieur le Président,
President Juncker, wherever you are, you're no doubt listening to us. You mentioned the dramatic consequences of climate change with us, but on the 25th of July, when you met Donald Trump, you committed the European Union to importing more GMO soil full of Roundup and shale gas. You have no mandate for this deal with America. You didn't hear the ardent desire on the part of Europeans to shrug off glyphosate and climate change. Your Commission has contributed to failing to impose anti-dumping duties on Chinese solar panels, leaving our industry open to their voracious appetite. Your deals with Mercosur and all the others mean a market of animals suffering, deforestation, bad food, climate change. So it's our responsibility to listen to the citizens of Europe, and to depend on the wind and the sun, not on Putin and Trump.
Mr. Huntis, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Juncker. From yesterday's discussion on Greece, it shows, and Europeans all of a sudden remember that there is no sovereignty in Europe. We all of a sudden remembered that the peoples of the South paid and bore the brunt of the crisis, that the priority in Europe is the interests of banks and multinationals and not the working people and the youth. This is where we are at right now in the European Union. This is the nature of the European Union. From the address of Mr. Juncker, now we understand that the future of Europe will be an intensification of austerity measures and reforms, a further dissolution of social rights, unemployment, poverty, which is a perfect ground for nationalism to prevail. But European nations will only be able to prosper outside of the European construction with a true ability of solidarity and prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Choka.
President Juncker,
it's game over. It's over with you telling fables about your vision for Europe. There used to be a Europe that was going to make sure that families were becoming richer and safer, but that is now failed. It's a doomed enterprise for families, citizens and businesses alike. And this European project has now led to the fact that they're poorer and less safe. Now, Mr. President said that Europe's peoples need certainty, but you don't know what Europe's population needs, unfortunately. The only certainty that the citizens of Europe have is that they don't like what you have to say. I think you need to self-assess your own policies, and this through the eyes of European citizens. They want you to step down. Please stop thinking that the Italians are there to be made fun of. And please stop telling lies too.
1.5 minutes, Mr. Prost.
Monsieur le
President, we're looking at we're stock taking your mandate, but that is not all. The global context is more difficult, and there isn't a lot of friendship and solidarity around. and you know that when it comes to trade with the US. The question asked by many members, what is Europe doing? What is the Commission doing? What are you doing, Mr. Juncker? I would prefer to put the question differently. What are the member states doing? A year ago, in the State of the Union, you talked about the European institutions, and you talked about reciprocity. And this was legitimized by what you said about Europe, which protects. And what about the expectations of companies and citizens? What are the member states when it comes to migration? And what are you doing when they no longer speak? And migration's policy based on the arrival of ships isn't serious. What people expect is that they're told the truth. States can't find a solution sometimes when they're given the means to do it. The failure of Europe, it's the failure of dialogue between the states. As you said just now, European sovereignty exists thanks to sovereignty of member states. It doesn't replace countries or member states.
Thank you. Mr. Andrieu, 1 minute.
Monsieur Juncker, et même si c'est important.
Mr. Juncker, however important it may be, we need something more important than changing the clocks. What you did on glyphosate will be what people remember from your Conservative term in office. You're leaving your defences against the rest of the world. You promised us an ambitious commission, the commission of the last chance, upholding the UN SDGs and a social and environmental economy, you said. But in fact, your commission has sacrificed our farmers on the altar of free trade, made a mockery of equality between men and women, and imperiled the health of millions of Europeans, not applying the precautionary principle on glyphosate, on endocrine disruptors or GMOs. And the multi-annual financial framework has no vision or ambition. That's not going to change the balance. What are you waiting for?
For 1.5 minutes, Mr. González Pons.
Señor Juncker, le agradezco la
Mr. Juncker, thank you for drawing that parallel between European patriotism and enlightened patriotism. That's why I would ask you in your programme to include the reform of the European arrest warrant. The world has changed a lot over the last 15 years. For example, it doesn't protect us against cyber terrorism or terrorist propaganda online, which you mentioned, and the manipulation of election results, which you also touched on. Personal data are not protected by the European arrest warrant, nor again attempted coups. My country, Spain, suffered an attempted coup a year ago. The Spanish Supreme Court does not have available to it all those responsible so that they could be brought to the President interjects.
Down a little for the interpreters. Apologies to interrupt your speech. Thank you.
I'll try, but I only have 1.5 minutes. Okay, so it's 1.5 minutes with a limit of words. Thank you. I will continue. Mi país, España.
My country, Spain, suffered an attempted coup a year ago, but the Spanish Supreme Court does not have all those behind it before it, because a court in another country has denied it that possibility. And Spain is not the only instance in which the European arrest warrant has not been working. The Spanish constitution cannot be protected without mutual confidence. If the European arrest warrant doesn't work properly, what's to become of Schengen? It doesn't make sense for Schengen to be used for certain countries to close their borders to refugees, while other countries open their borders to criminals. This is no time for squabbling and judging one another or attacking one another. If we want a European Union which is truly united, then it has to be a European Union of justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Fayon, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, President. In the EU, borders seem to only be open for capital. They're being closed for people. Xenophobic attacks are no longer considered as half-witted babbling. They're part and parcel of argumentative strategy. The space for criticizing xenophobia and its discourse is shrinking, and the pressure to accept such rhetoric as common practice is mounting. Populist leaders are spreading fear of an imaginary group of people. The refugee crisis is being abused to cover up a crisis of the European institutions. The main mistake lies in the inadequate common asylum policy, which should be based on solidarity. Before the elections next year, the EU is faced with a choice. Either it will choose radical xenophobia or radical social changes. If it is to survive, those of us who believe in its achievements have to fight for the respect of European values. The other road leads to closing in national states.
Thank you. Mr. Rangel, 1.5 minutes.
Senhora Presidente. President, Mr. President of the Commission, first of all, I would like to pay homage here to Mr. Juncker as a true European. He, in fact, is an example to all of us in that regard. I'd like to raise a point where I was rather disappointed with the vision he set before us, namely the forthcoming multiannual financial framework. The Commission has come forward with a proposal which increases divergences. It's a poor proposal for the cohesion countries. How can you explain a 24% for Spain and 5% for Finland? How can it be that Croatia is losing 6% and Italy is getting 6% more? If you argue that certain countries have had growth, that's an easy argument. So they're trying to make up the gap, and they're being punished by the European funds, even though they've reached a level which is far below the average. That's not the way forward for the next 7 years. This is no discourse for the future. So we need thoroughly to revisit the MFF. I'm concerned to see Portugal having this conformist attitude, as previous speakers said. We've been growing, but from a low basis. We need to condemn the socialist policy. Lastly, respect for the Solidarity Fund applied in the instance of wildfires in Portugal. More than half of the funds was used for red tape rather than addressing the situation on the ground. That's deplorable, and the Commission should speak out about that. The money in the Solidarity Fund is for the victims and the regions affected, not for the Portuguese state apparatus.
Mr. Rangel, there is a blue card request from Madam Rodrigues. Do you accept? Madam, 30 seconds, please.
Mr.
Rangel, sound that you couldn't resist turning a European debate into a national debate, but on your point, I don't think you're in any position to say what you've just said. You represent a government which worsens the qualitative and quantitative position of Portugal, whereas the socialist government have been doing the exact opposite. So I think you should withdraw your comments.
Just before you start, Mr. Rangel.
Another one.
No, please. It is a question usually on the debate. It was more a point, but you have 30 seconds to respond.
I would just like to say this. I was talking about the multi-annual financial framework. I know that for Mr. Rodrigues, it's of no interest to see the Portuguese government making poor use of it. But I mentioned Italy, Finland, and the other countries. And I would say that the poor position on employment was thanks to the Socrates government of your party. Thankfully, in the video on Greece, there was acknowledgement that Passos Coelho's government did a lot of good for Portugal. The President interjects.
1 minute, please. Mr. Kufel.
Thank you, Madam President. As a co-rapporteur of the Financial Crimes and Tax Committee, I was pleased to hear you talk about the need for combating money laundering. What we see in Europe is a crisis, and we need a real comprehensive reform of anti-money laundering systems, regulations and authorities. It's not only a crisis, it's not only money laundering, it's a tax evasion and tax avoidance crisis too. It's corruption, it's terrorist finance. It's already too rich and too powerful, swindling the tax coffers of our countries, and this must be stopped now. For some of Europe's largest banks, the free movement of capital has become freedom from responsibility. It is because these banks are so-called, well, too big to fail. Let me tell the Commission, these banks have already failed. They have failed their responsibility to society, and we need to hold them accountable. In the Danske Bank case alone, transactions worth more than the entire state budget of Denmark is now under suspicion of money laundering. So, President Juncker and Commission, we need not only to talk tough on holding banks accountable, we need to be tough on the banks. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Niedermayer, 1 minute.
Well, thank you very much. I know 1 minute and not too many words. Jobs and growth, this was the key slogan of the European Commission a few years ago, and I wonder if all of us still remember that. The world has changed, and sometimes it's changed actually to better. Also, despite the unfortunate decision of the people of the United Kingdom, the position of the European Union in the world has strengthened significantly, and now the European Union represents hopes and wishes of hundreds of millions of people all around the world. But successes of the past belong to the past. What counts is the future. And the way how we will tackle the challenges and the problems of today will decide about the future of our union and of our continent. And the list of these problems is demanding. Migration, security, economic problems, foreign policy, tax issues, environment are among those on the list. But we shouldn't forget, and this is what Mr. Juncker has said, the unity, cooperation and solidarity is what will decide if we succeed, and we shouldn't forget it. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam Bresso.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Vice President, please could you remind President Juncker that we very much appreciated his call for a sovereign Europe, but also for a Europe in which the euro functions in a full manner, and above all, the strength with which he proposed the application of the passerelle clause. We would have appreciated a response from the Council on that. Let me also, however, recall that the economic crisis, which has been the scourge of our continent during recent years, which has increased the gap between rich and poor, needs to be dealt with, and we need to work for a fairer Europe. That should be our main task. We need to fight the sense of solitude in which many Europeans live. We need to boost a feeling of community. We need to come up with measures for European children. We need to deal with unemployment, and we need to deal with the salary gap between men and women. The European social pillar needs to be at the heart of the European pillars of the future, and it's only in that way that we can deal with people such as Orban and others. Thank you.
Mr. Karas, 1 minute.
Frau Präsidentin, meine
President, members of the House. What a difference if we compare the discussion on the rule of law and basic rights with Jean-Claude Juncker's today. One divides Europe, the other makes the idea of Europe into a political programme and a response to the challenges that we face in Europe and in the world, and brings Europe together. So thank you to you, Jean-Claude Juncker. We can also see the barriers, the attitudes and the ignorance that has to be overcome in order to put the Juncker plan into action. Let's begin with the votes at lunchtime. European democracy is more than the sum of its national democratic parts. We have to refuse authoritarians and ground our democracy. We need to make the Europe into a political force capable of action. I agree with the analysis that says that goals need to be achieved. Let's move obstacles from the legislative path. Let's accelerate legislative procedure so that before the elections we can meet the concerns and make steps forward. Let's make If you have political will, you can achieve an awful lot.
Mr. Karas, there's a blue card request from Madam Grappini. Will you accept the question? Madam Grappini, you accept, Mr. Karas? Yes.
Doamnă președintă. Domnule Karas.
Thank you, President. Mr. Karas, you talked about the Juncker speech in positive terms. Mr. Juncker said that he wanted a Europe of peace and prosperity. Now, I understand your view, but can we really have peace and prosperity without cohesion? Do you agree with the cuts to the cohesion funds that the Commission has proposed for the next financial period? How can one achieve priority and understanding for the people on the single market without that? In a minute, you can't answer all of the questions that one might put. But the fact is that values, the rule of law, and meeting goals is something that will guarantee more peace and prosperity and stability than other things. The budget negotiations will be tough because the challenges the EU face require more money, more solidarity than the budget currently has available to it. The differences between the Commission, the Council and the Parliament positions is large, but everyone has to take a leap forward so that the Juncker programme can be put into action.
Now, for 1 minute, I give the floor to Mr. Weidenholzer.
Thank you very much. This is really addressed to President Juncker. This morning, very good speech, forward-looking, full of good intentions, as so often in the past. But we've got to look at what is implemented. 2015, you talked about efficient border supervision systems. 3 years later, we find that we've not made much progress in that direction, and the reallocation of refugees has been a very fraught and difficult process. And we hear information that our efforts in that area is chronically underfunded. Schools have had to be closed. Proposals have been put forward, which we're very happy to discuss and debate. But let's not forget, we've got to do our homework and make sure that there is funding for the requisite capabilities in the surrounding area. Otherwise, we'll see a repetition of what happened in 2015. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam De Lange. I beg your pardon, De Lange.
Work? Yeah, fantastic. Ik zal de uitspraak.
Thank you very much, Madam President. De Lange, it's exactly how it's said. I'm going to be speaking in Dutch because I know that the President of the Commission understands Dutch. And it's really a personal appeal. For 4 years in the State of the Union debate, I've been saying what my criticisms were, and the Commission and the President of the Commission today must be thanked for what they've done. He has worked from his heart and all the way down to his toes, pleading for European solutions, and that in difficult times. Look at migration. All of Europe talks about better protection for our external frontier. The Commission comes along with a proposal of 10,000 border guards and better, more efficient deportation and return policies, and then listen to the response. What's it going to cost? Who's going to pay for that? Is this not taking away powers from member states? Who is blamed if nothing is done? The European Union and indeed the Commission first and foremost. The State of the Union is a debate and it's a call for a sense of responsibility and for leadership. And I hope that's what we get this time round. And thank you, Commission, for having given us this basis. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute, Madam Garcia Perez.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank Mr. Juncker for the self-criticism he used in his speech. He recognised the problems that the European project is suffering. During this time, there's been a lack of courage, there's been a lack of leadership to steer, in terms of steering the European ship on the right path. But in spite of populists and the extreme right, Europe is more alive than ever, and it is more necessary than ever to face up to the challenges that we have. We need a strong Europe that takes on common positions and shows solidarity to deal with the challenge of migration and to restore dignity to our project. We need a Europe that can translate economic growth into social justice and redistribution. We need strong welfare states. We need a European Union that can fight climate change. We need a European Union with a woman's face that does away with gender-based violence and ensures more equality in society. We need a Europe that restores our pride in belonging to a space of community and respect. A strong Europe brings us all together. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, 1 minute.
Thank you, President, and thank you, President Juncker.
You referred to the Juncker plan, which is so successful in helping us get over the economic recovery that they no longer call it the Juncker plan. And as the ITRE rapporteur for its successor, InvestEU, I hope that can be equally successful. I think you also deserve great credit for negotiating with the wayward Donald Trump, helping to avoid a trade war, and that was much appreciated by businesses across Europe, especially in my own country, who relies so much on trade with the US. And mentioning my own country, Ireland, I thank you again for expressing total solidarity with Ireland, especially in the need to avoid a hard border. And I would appeal to you, though, to accompany that with a financial commitment to help businesses, farmers, SMEs, who are inevitably going to be affected one way or the other as a consequence of Brexit. You quoted the French philosopher saying he liked things to go together. If that solidarity went together with a financial commitment, I would be very pleased, especially before the elections, because we all see that it's easier and easier to win elections by bashing Brussels. This will help to prevent that.
Thank you, colleagues. I now move to catch the eye, and I will try and take the maximum number, but somebody and many people may be disappointed. Please stick to 1 minute, and I begin by giving the floor to Mr. Cristoforo. 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Madam President. We believe and we support the European Union because we believe that the Union has a vision and a future. And I agree with the President of the Commission, Mr. Juncker, saying that we need a strong European Union. But to get a strong European Union, a precondition is that we defend the rights and the privileges and the prerogatives of the member states. And we cannot have a bargain basement European Union, and we cannot make concessions or discounts to countries such as Turkey, which does not respect the fundamental rights of all of the member states. And I think we've got to defend the rights and prerogatives of member states, particularly those which are under threat from Turkey. And measures must be taken. What we expect from President Juncker is to stand up and tell Turkey, respect the fundamental rights of Cyprus and of Greece, and no discount for the European perspective for them or anyone else. Thank you.
Okay. There will be less catch the eye if everybody goes over 1 minute. So I will ask you please to stick to the time. Mr. Blanco Lopez, 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much, President. Alarm bells are ringing, President. Things are not looking good in Europe. The extreme right is on the rise, and they're using xenophobic, populist and extremist discourse which goes against the fundamental values of the European Union. I am concerned that there is a lack of discourse used to fight what they say. In addition, we are moving forward too slowly. We defend cohesion, but we don't provide the resources necessary. We cut cohesion policy in the CAP. We want to be leaders in the fight against climate change, but this year emissions have increased and the resources that we're going to earmark for the fight against climate change have been cut. President, we want to engage with European citizens, but we need to ensure that words are accompanied by deeds. We need to move forward with the social pillar.
1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. We believe in the European Union of the nations and the peoples, not the banks, not a European Union of banks, one which supports the principle of subsidiarity. And I think that that way is the best guarantee for peaceful coexistence. In the Eurozone, we've got to see an end to the Stability Pact, which means that Germany is able to build up enormous surpluses. And we need a decentralized system of central banks so that the member states can have their full economic sovereignty and have a say which is in line with their pro rata contribution to the resources of the European Central Bank. Greece has got a special situation when it comes to shipbuilding and energy and animal production, and it must be able to go its own way where appropriate. Thank you. Microphone, please, for Mrs. Voutmans. Thank you very much, Madam President. I'm very glad that the Commission and President Juncker is proposing European solutions today. Those were ambitious thoughts. I think you could be even more ambitious. The level of ambition could be even higher. We're looking at the qualified majority, and I think we've got to go further when it comes to external policy and also defence. Can I just repeat my own plea for a European intelligence service in order to combat terrorism? And we have to crack down on human trafficking. In particular, unaccompanied minors. They need special protection, and they must not simply disappear into the woodwork across Europe. We talk about now the end of the change to summertime. Well, let's do that, and let's listen to the voice of voters and ordinary citizens when it comes to summertime. Listen to what they're saying. So, yes, these plans, make sure that you deliver on these. Let's speed up the passage from the words to deeds. Thank you.
For 1 minute, please.
11:50 hora de Strasburgo.
11:50 is the time in Strasbourg. 10:45 in Portugal, Ireland and the Canary Islands. So we have all of these differences. But we have now the proposal presented by Mr. Juncker, and I think this is an opportunity to ensure that their time zones can be appropriate. This time change had been proposed by Franco's people so that they could adapt to the time in Nazi Germany. Then there was a change in Galicia, and in Galicia, actually, the time difference between the actual time and the legal time is 2 hours. This has consequences on people's quality of life. So I think all of this situation needs to be dealt with, and I think if we harmonise times, that's not good.
Thank you, Madam President. President Juncker belongs, of course, to the EPP, and he was speaking as a European Democrat for the future, looking forwards. Yesterday, Mr. Orban also belongs to the EPP party. He talked about a Europe which was looking backwards to the past. We prefer the first vision, the first direction, and I'd like to thank Mr. President Juncker for what the positive things he said about my country of Greece. And I hope that everyone hears that message in Athens, including the parties of the opposition, who are currently doom-laden with prophecies of doom. Let us do all that we can, everything in our power, to build as broad a pro-European and progressive coalition as we can in order to not go down the path of looking back and turning in, which is what the populists and the extremists want us to do.
Thank you. Mr. Castaldo.
Thank you, President. Well, President Juncker, I listened to your speech very carefully this year as well, and the first thing that came into mind was a quote from the Gatto Pardo. We want everything to change to ensure that everything stays as it is, because once again we're repeating the same errors. Your attention goes to the instruments using rather than the policies that govern them. The migrant crisis, you're trying to explain to citizens how to deal with that without trying to deal with the Dublin system and also a system to manage economic migrants. And if we don't deal with the problems, then we'll simply be enforcing rules that are anachronistic, inappropriate and unfair. Dublin cannot be changed by unanimous voting. I think what we need to do is have big support from the Commission for those states who actually demonstrate solidarity rather than just expressing solidarity. Now the change in the time, the change in the clocks, that's one thing that you're doing. The speaker's interrupted.
Epitideos.
Thank you, Madam President. President Juncker, in his speech, tried to embellish what was happening today in Europe, talked about a united Europe. I must say that we want a Europe of nations and peoples that cooperates within its ranks. But we say no when the Union does everything to erode national sovereignty. And we must make sure that the legitimate interests of the nations and the peoples are properly respected. We don't want a multi-speed Europe. That is not a success if certain member states are simply closing their borders and turning Greece into a big open-air holding camp. We cannot see continued unemployment and pauperisation of entire peoples. We cannot become a global policeman in this so-called fight against terrorism. Thank you.
Drova, 1 minute.
Děkuji za udělení slova, vážený pane předsedo.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. President of the Commission, I'm very happy to hear you stress the Commission's work at the end of your speech, particularly its work in Central and Eastern Europe. Security is a major issue. And I also agree with the stress you put on cooperation with Africa. This too is a very important area of work. I also back the bolstering of Frontex. I've seen at first hand that it's important that we reinforce this border guard and give more resources to its 10,000 employees. I'm also happy that you stress the importance of calling for human rights in China, or the respect of human rights in China. It's good to hear the Commission showing a little more scepticism towards Marx and Putin. Thank you very much for your words, Mr. Juncker. Let's not forget, however, that the Commission still has some work on its plate.
President Juncker expressed his love for Europe's history. I share that love, but I would have liked him to give us more of a symphony in his speech rather than simply sticking to the basics, because you can't propose new legislation when you haven't complied with the current laws you have, and when you can't ensure that the legislation you're proposing will actually see the light of day, because we're seeing an erosion of fundamental rights and an erosion of trust. That's what explains the current situation. Now, President Juncker regretted the lack of legal options to deal with migratory flows. But many of us in this Parliament have been working hard to ensure that legal ways for paths to migration are opened. We've been insisting on this need without support from the Commission, and we've seen resistance from the Council. But this was a last chance Commission, and we really need to make sure that we work hard to ensure that nationalism and populists can't win. The speaker is interrupted by the President.
Mr. Siliakotis, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. President Juncker tries to embellish the situation, but the situation is becoming ever more acute, and the economic and political crisis is becoming more acute on a daily basis, deepening. The top priority has to be making inroads into unemployment and to increase poverty. But what we see instead of that is a widening of the various gaps between different sections of the community, different parts of the European Union. And that's what gives leverage and traction to those on the right who are trying to divide people and exploit the disgruntlement which is there in the population. And I'm afraid that we're playing into their hands if we go for a defence community which is a fortress, which has got a standing army and which has got bristles with weapons at the external frontiers. We've got to turn that policy on its head so we have one of solidarity, peace and less social injustice. Thank you very much.
Mr. Delli, 1 minute.
Köszönöm, elnök asszony. Sajnálattal ad okot, hogy az óraállít...
President, it's a great shame that we didn't hear much about the West Balkans in Mr. Juncker's speech. We did hear a lot about the summertime issue, however. I think it would be useful to mention Belgrade and Pristina. The Commission's approaches to those are inconsistent, and that's rather reinforcing the status quo rather than promoting accession. I think we should supporting these negotiating partners rather than scaremongering. We need to listen to what they have to say rather than just ignore it. If there's no uniform support, then the negotiating partners are not going to be able to move forward. And if there's no result, then the whole region will be unstable.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Domnule președinte Juncker, domnule comisar Timmermans, sunt de acord cu ceea ce a spus.
President, Commissioner Timmermans, I agree with what you say. We need a united Europe, we need a single currency, we need patriotism. I think every member of the European Parliament would support those things. We're hearing about the summit in Romania, but also we're talking about defending our foreign borders. However, our external borders, but how can we do that, for example, in Romania when we're not members of the Schengen area? Romania currently satisfies all the conditions to become a member of Schengen, and so it needs help. In addition, we'll have the rotating presidency of the European Council next year, and so we'll have to be a member of Schengen by then. We believe that all countries should be respected, President.
Mrs. Verkunen.
Arvoisa puheenjohtaja, olen komission puheenjohtajan kanssa samaa mieltä siitä, että...
Thank you, President. I agree with the President of the Commission when he says that the European Union needs to be bolstered, both in Europe and across the globe. We have a lot of potential at international level when it comes to trade agreements or investment. We also have a role to play in global development. Today we need to highlight the European Union's unity, although some are calling that into question by turning their backs on the fundamental values of the European Union. Those values are being violated, values like fundamental rights and the rule of law. This affects not just those countries and their citizens, but the whole of the EU, its very nature, and the faith that one can put in the European Union. We discussed this yesterday. I think it's important that we have effective tools which allow us to act in circumstances like this, and it's a shame to see this being relevant to a number of member states at the moment. The European Union can only function if all of our values and rights are respected.
Doamna președinte, stimați colegi, apreciez discursul domnului Juncker echilibrat și responsabil.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The speech today, solidarity, well, we need that more than ever before, particularly faced with today's challenges. But I listened to Mr. Weber. I think that would simply seek to weaken the European plan and give extra ammunition to Eurosceptics. And that, of course, is not what we want to do. Mr. Weber, Romania deserves to be in the Schengen area because Romania has met all its obligations vis-à-vis Europe, and Romanian citizens have the same rights as all other European citizens. And the way in which you and other colleagues are attacking Romania only serves to weaken the confidence of Romanians in the European project. And unfortunately, Mr. Weber, you have turned the EPP party into the European Populist Party. Thank you, Madam President. First of all, can I thank President Juncker for the kind words and the sentiments expressed vis-à-vis Greece and Greece staying within the euro. However, people listen to the European Union when it does things which improve their daily lives and their bread and butter issues. And we're working on the MFF, the Multi-Annual Financial Framework, and we've got to be competitive. Horizon Europe, programmes such as that have got to be given proper funding. Certainly border guards. We need border guards to supervise our borders. But we also need unified procedures to cope with the migratory flows. That's every bit as important. Defence, combating international crime, of course that's important, but we need practical measures which people will thank us for.
Heaney, 1 minute, please.
Doamna președintă, domnule comisar, vreau și eu să...
President, Commissioner, well, let me also congratulate you on your speech, Mr. Juncker. We need unity, prosperity, and many others have already said that. As others have said, we also need these principles to be put into practice. But let me also add that unfortunately, until this point, we haven't managed to achieve the desired cohesion. I'd like to thank Mr. Bullman for what he said. He said we have to take account of Eastern countries. They need to be included rather than stigmatised, as has been happening for far too long. Mr. Weber does it, for example, as part of his campaign that's been going on for far too long. Now, we want to ensure there is fairness and peace within the European Union. Commissioner, you know my country well, and I hope you'll take account of everything that my colleagues have said. Romania needs to be part of the Schengen area, and it needs to be made equal with other member states, because we all belong to the same club, the European Union. Thank you.
Mr. Ferreira, 1 minute. Sir, are you going to take your speaking slot? 50 seconds.
Muito obrigado. Este debate redundou no...
Thank you. Well, what we're hearing is cynicism, propaganda, and the like. It's an attempt to reinforce those who are already in power. The citizenship that you're talking about is citizenship for the powerful, being able to do what they like in their own interest. The military expenditure has been timed by 20, but Mr. Juncker is saying that we're not militarizing. Europe is imposing underemployment, job insecurity and unemployment on its citizens. It's all been fine words, but it's really hiding an ineffectiveness in action. This project needs to be undone to create a Europe of the poor, a Europe of peace, cooperation and the workers.
Thank you, President. The slogans from President Juncker about competitive EU in the global context really reminds us that we've got China, Russia, the US, and they want to exert control over the energy supply and over whole continents such as Africa. I'm afraid that the bottom line here is militarisation. That's really what this is about, and special majorities required for cooperative programmes. However, basically there is an anti-grassroots supervision of the economic and financial circuits, and this means that the profit gain is being put before people, profit is being put before people. And this is what the extreme nationalist populist forces are tapping into, and that's where the strength is coming from currently. Thank you very much.
Thank you, colleagues. That completes our Catch the Eye. I was, in the end, able to take everyone who requested and was in the chamber, because the Commission will not respond in the debate at this point. So we move next to our groups and begin with the non-SCREE. Mr. Wolf, 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Madam President. President Juncker, may I congratulate you on your final State of the Union speech. And whilst many people will be congratulating you on that and your vision for the future, I just thought it might be pertinent to remind you of what actually happened in Europe during your tenure. On the economy, we have seen the collapse of many European countries. In youth unemployment in Greece sits at 43.2%, in Spain 38.8%, in Croatia 23.6%. In Greece, the children of the grandchildren today will still be paying off the 100 billion of debt that has been left upon them. Poverty, misery and sadness covers Europe like a dark mist of perpetual pain. Whilst in the Mediterranean 45,000 bodies will have been buried there, you will have seen millions swarm into Europe illegally, and you have seen the deaths of 400 under terrorist attacks. Whilst you and your fellow unelected colleagues raise a glass or two to the State of the Union, the rest of Europe will be asking, what is the Union's state? Thank you.
Mr. Annemans, 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I think that the State of the Union speech this year, well, one of the takeaways, of course, is that this is your last State of the Union speech. You have got many admirers, but there was a lot in that about old Europe and the old European Union. What we now need urgently is a new European Union, because there is the current one is deeply flawed, and it's got a deeply flawed blueprint as well. More powers being taken into the European Union, that is the wrong way to go. More European citizens want a new European Union where the peoples and the nations do not disappear, where they emerge strengthened. Cosmopolitical, open thinking, that's you're trying to paint the populists as blackguards, and that's the dominant discourse now. But I think that you've got to look again at what you've said in this speech, and remember, we're preparing for a whole new world. Thank you.
Monsieur Juncker, Monsieur Timmermans.
Mr. Juncker, Mr. Timmermans, I'm happy to see And Europeans will be happy to see the end of your term so that we don't have to deal with the Juncker-Zellmeyer double act anymore. You've turned the European Union into something ultra-liberal, and the Commission will continue to create damage and do harm if it does that. In your federalist US, you're in denial and you're engaged in institutional lying. You say you want to force the border guards, but when France controlled its border, we did it effectively. You also want the European Union to get its hands on foreign affairs, but that's the last bastion of major policy areas remaining in the hands of the member states. You spout solidarity. However, your country, Mr. Juncker, has engaged in the worst acts of fiscal piracy. The LuxLeaks scandal shows your guilt has been proven. Stop to the European disunion. I don't want to see a Frexit, but I'm also against your utopian view of the United States of Europe. We don't want to see any Africanization of Europe, Islamic terrorism, globalism, and the pillage by the multinationals and the internet giants. We want an independent Europe of nations protecting its peoples, and we will have that.
Mrs. Zimmer, 1 minute, please.
Ja, ich möchte nur ganz kurz.
Well, just very briefly, I wanted to take the floor once again. We heard Mr. Juncker's responses to our initial statements, and he was talking about the social pillar, particularly when it came to introducing guarantees for children in all member states of the European Union. But I just want to say that the treaties do give the possibility of an EU-wide minimum income that can be dealt with at the European level. There are initiatives already been carried out on homeless people and on those living in poverty. And this is coming onto the agenda in all member states now. So we would appreciate a proposal from the European Commission on a minimum income for citizens right across Europe.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr. Torvalds.
Thank you, Madam President. You can be a European patriot and a Finnish patriot. You can be a European patriot and a Hungarian patriot. But you can't be a European patriot and a nationalist. That doesn't go together. Jean-Claude Juncker spoke very nicely about his love affair with Europe. We all know that love affairs are difficult. That goes with European love affairs, that goes with Finnish love affairs, that goes with Hungarian love affairs. But love affairs needs possibilities, ability to make decisions. If we can't make the decisions about our love affairs, we're going to lose this out. And therefore, I'm all for love affairs, but I'm all for decisions, and I thank Jean-Claude for his nice words about his love affair with Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kamal for 3.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. At its heart, today's State of the Union was actually an appraisal of the Commission, of us in this Parliament, and of the whole European Union. And too often, when we are wrapped in our bubble of commentators, blogs, news cycles and work programmes, we often forget that it is the people, the taxpayers and the voters that we serve, and not the other way round. But we hear many in this chamber tell voters that their concerns are unfounded, or that the way they have chosen to vote is nationalistic or populist. But by attempting to shut out parties who do not share their vision and do not believe in the project, they also shut out many voters and push them further away. Now, I know that Mr. Juncker has worked very hard to regain the confidence of voters, but many people in many EU member states feel that the EU has lost its way, that it has failed to deliver on issues such as jobs, it has failed to deliver on their concerns over migration, it has failed to deliver on them feeling safer in their home countries and on the things that they care about. So when politicians here talk about winning back their confidence, it rings hollow to those that are still willing to listen, as they feel that they have heard it all before. Now, I remember only too well in 2014, as President Juncker addressed this chamber full of freshly elected MEPs, declaring it to be a moment to be a new start for Europe, and said that we should play as a team with common policies. Yet voters have seen attempts to push divisive migration policies that sadly, rather than helping people, have reduced some sympathy in some quarters for refugees and those fleeing war and persecution, rather than going around the table and asking each country what they can do, rather than telling them what to do. You spoke of greater transparency, but the public reading the papers of the appointment of a Commission Secretary General that was clouded in secrecy. He said that Europe cannot spend money that it does not have, but see a multi-annual budget demanding more money at a time when one of the largest net contributors is leaving. He talked about considering giving the Eurozone its own budget capacity and powers, but as the people of Germany will tell you, there is no such thing as European money. My group agrees with Mr Juncker when he said we don't need a European solution to everything, and this is still the case. So European Conservatives and Reformists ask that this Commission President and the future Commission Presidents listen to the people who have lost confidence in the EU. Now, I know at times that our group can be the greatest critics, but real friends tell each other the hard truths, and we work together where we agree. So the ECR calls to start people on the Commission to start delivering the kind of European Union that people want and deserve. Not an EU which increasingly replaces national governments, not a European Union that is dismantled and destroyed, but a reformed European Union that Mr Juncker promised to deliver here in this chamber 5 years ago. With vital elections next year, this is the 11th hour for the EU. It is time to move on from the 1950s model of a federalised EU, an outdated vision of yesterday, and it's time to deliver an EU shaped by the wishes of its peoples, those who want a better tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you. 2 minutes, Mr. Bullmann. Thank you.
Diese Debatte hat gezeigt,
this debate has shown that we need to reinforce citizens' confidence in the European Union. And so I turn to the Commission and say that I think there has to be some upshot from this discussion. We've said that we need a basic guarantee for every child in the European Union. The President has said that he would make sure an initiative was begun, and I will make sure, I will keep an eye on that. We've said that we have to ensure the rights of people on internet platforms. For us, it's entirely unacceptable that in most EU countries women earn less for the same work than men. When will the Commission be coming forward with a proposal to counter that? Ms Simmer is right, saying we need a framework directive guaranteeing a minimum income in Europe. That is essential if we are to bridge the disparities in the single market. We've said that we want to become more sustainable and to create a new economic model. That has to be visible in the European semester. The figures have to tell the truth about our environmental consumption, about employment. Reform the European semester and give us the possibility to make progress in the monetary and economic union so that the European Union can actually be capable of meaningful action. We've called on the Commission to be active in fighting against cyber criminality. I'm happy to hear Mr Juncker say that he will take initiatives, but I would call on the Austrian presidency and say the following. In December you have a special summit. Why not appeal to all of the member states to take steps to make sure that the European elections next year are secure and can't be manipulated by third parties? Now is the time to act. The Austrian presidency is responsible for this special summit making real progress, particularly, for example, in rescuing people on the high seas. It's a scandal what's happening on the high seas, and I hope that you'll be able to take some initiative. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Weber.
Ja, Frau Präsidentin, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, auch ich möchte zum Schluss mich bedanken.
President, colleagues, well, I'd also like to thank you for the constructive discussion that we've had, and we are pleased to find the Commission in work mode. The European Parliament, I think, can also be proud of what we've done, and what we're proposing. But there's one thing that's very important. In 2018, we must ensure that we provide answers to the migration issue, because otherwise citizens will be saying, why has nothing been done? Why haven't we been able to deal with this issue? So I think that has to be our top priority. Now, when it comes to the future, let me just take a couple of points from the State of the Union speech that I think are important. Firstly, security, the feeling of security that people have. And secondly, fairness in Europe. We need a new approach to fairness in a digital world. And to conclude, President, during the first round of speakers, there was a debate as to whether the crisis had been overcome or not, whether the problems had been resolved or not, whether there was a lot to do or not. I think we will only be able to convince people in Europe when we're optimistic. We need to be able to say that we are in the situation to deal with problems, that we can solve their challenges, and we can be proud of what we're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Colleagues, that concludes our debate on the State of the Union. We will have a short recess and votes will begin at 12:30. Thank you.